All right, so we are now done with the First Amendments in a very shallow viewing of them. We've kind of gone over what they are, what they say, and a little bit of detail on each one, but really haven't gone into much detail on the big ones. So the first big amendment we're going to really go through in a great deal of detail is the First Amendment. So if you in your textbooks, this is Chapter 4, Section 1. All right, so the First Amendment is for everybody. So as long as you're here, you have free speech rights that due to the 14th Amendment, including all persons having the rights of the U.S. under the U.S. Constitution. If you're here, you have the right to free speech. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that if you're here illegally and you go out and speak that you can just do that. The problem is you wouldn't be arrested for the speech. You'd be arrested for your illegal status. So if you have a question about that, the current event stuff going on right now with the with immigration enforcement, when you're arrested for being illegal, just know that that's the reason you're being arrested for, is because your status here is not legal, so you're being arrested for that. So if someone comes out and is protesting, saying, I'm an illegal immigrant, I support America, but I should be here illegally, I should get amnesty, whatever, they have the right to go out and talk about that, but they also are committing a separate crime being here illegally. So if you ever have a question about that, that's that dynamic and how it interacts. So yes, they are free to speak, but they are not free to be here illegally because their status is not legal. So that's basically how that works. So you'll see in the news every now and then someone at a pro-amnesty rally for illegal immigrants who is themselves illegal getting arrested at that rally. That's why. They're not being arrested for the speech they're making. They're being arrested for their status as being illegal or undocumented in this country. All right, so let's go over those First Amendment freedoms. There are a total of 5 of them, but we need to know where they come from. First Amendment, obviously, it's not, I just said 10 Commandments. No, it's not the 10 Commandments. Wrong set of laws. It's in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. When we think of the first 10 amendments in general, understand that we're talking about civil liberty amendments. Most of the first 10 amendments, with the exception of the 10th Amendment, really relate to how individuals have their rights protected under our constitutional government. The first 10 amendments are: the person has the right. The person has the right to be free from, to free of, to be free. And the later amendments kind of curtail that. You have the 14th Amendment saying, well, the government's still curtailed. You have changes in how voting works over time. But the first 10 amendments are really all about the rights of the individual and being protected from government for the most part. All right, the First Amendment freedoms. There's 5 basic freedoms in the First Amendment. And they are religion, speech, press, peaceful assembly, and petition. And here's the actual text. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So all 5 are in the little paragraph, and there are books written on this one little paragraph. So understand, we're not going to be reading books right now. This is going into like a shallow understanding and explanation of what these rights do, what they mean, and there are entire courses in law schools and colleges all related to speech, journalism, religion, and how this one paragraph interacts with our government. All right, so first one, freedom of religion. The freedom of religion has 2 clauses. So there's 2 parts to our constitutional freedom of religion section of the First Amendment. Here's the first part. This is also known as the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The idea being that, hey, we have a country, but we're not a Christian country. We're not a Muslim country. We're not a country of any... That's the obvious one. That's the one, like, well, okay, well, there is no state religion. Well, we got that. That's the easy one to figure out. Now, what does it mean to respect an establishment of religion? You get into issues like, well, does it include things like... Can you give out money for vouchers to what's called a parochial school or a religious school? Can the government pay to send somebody to a religious school? Can the government give money to religious schools? That's where we come into this whole not favoring issue. So respecting the establishment of religion would be, let's say I was the county commissioner for Nash County or the Nash County School Board, and I wanted to free up some money to allow kids who were at a failing school to have vouchers that took them to a private school. That private school happens to be Catholic, but I only let them go to the Catholic school. That would be unconstitutional because I'm favoring that Catholic religion. But if I were to say, okay, I'm going to give vouchers to any student who's in a failing school to go to any private school in Nash County, and that would include Rocky Mount Academy and a few others, religious and secular or non-religious schools. That would be okay because it's neutral. It doesn't favor one religion over another, and it doesn't favor religion over non-religion. So it doesn't hurt anybody. It's basically treating everybody the same way. Now here's the other part, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So this is the free exercise clause. And this is where you get in some interesting dynamical. The obvious one is, what if my religion requires that I do a drug that's illegal? Well, then you got a whole bunch of hairy issues you got to go in and talk about. Are they allowed to do this? You might know about peyote cactuses as a religion. The Native American culture uses that, and it's legal in certain areas. You also think there's also a very famous tea case where they would drink a mildly hallucinogenic tea that would make them see lights differently, and they consider that religious part of their religion. And they had to be allowed to have their tea. It's a very famous case. I might give it to y'all in the class as a case study one day. So overall, this clause means people have the freedom to practice their faith as they choose, or to not practice at all. That's free exercise. You can choose to practice or to not practice. And there are certain limitations. Your practice cannot include human sacrifice, because that would obviously counterbalance the whole community law versus the rights of the community versus the rights of the individual. You don't want that. There's also certain cultures that involve certain scarring of children. Think about some religious cultures out in Polynesia, Africa, where they scar children, do that kind of, it's very ceremonial, it was considered religion. You'd have a hard time doing that here, because there'd be a community issue, a community right, or a community idea that you don't want to do that. You're protecting the children, that whole perspective. Famous cases involve what we call Christian Scientists. They are people that basically believe in the power of prayer to heal, and there were cases where Christian Scientists would not take medicine for their children to basically cure a very curable disease, something like chickenpox or mumps, basically to keep their kid alive. And the state basically took over and said, yeah, we're taking your kid away because they shouldn't die of chickenpox because you want to pray away the chickenpox. The community interest in keeping that child alive outweighed the parents' individual right to religious exercise for their family. So there are issues where that comes into conflict, and it does change depending on how devastating the case is for the individual or the community. Now, second issue, the government cannot treat you differently because of your personal beliefs. Now that's where the drug issue comes in. Well, I'm not prohibiting drug use. I'm not prohibiting drug use of your religion. I'm prohibiting drug use, period. No one can do it for religious purposes or for non-religious purposes. Doesn't matter. And that's the basis for think like Rastafarianism or certain other cultures that you have to identify with that culture to use their the drug that they use for their religious experience. There are certain exceptions to that. Like there are sometimes what they'll do is they'll make a law that outlaws that particular activity. A very famous one is like a Santeria religion, basically has animal sacrifice. And what they did, because they didn't like the idea of this one little church sacrificing, I think at the time it was chickens, as part of their religion, the locals didn't like that in the area. And I want to say this is in either Florida or Louisiana. I think it was the Gulf Coast somewhere. Basically, they passed a local ordinance saying the slaughtering of animals is illegal within the city limits of blah, 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 the city where the Santeria church was doing this. And the church basically came back and said, this law was only made to discriminate against us. Before we got here, they didn't have this law. And now because of our religion and their discrimination against it, they made this law. So sometimes laws are made that look neutral on their face, like no slaughtering animals. Okay, that makes perfect sense. You don't want a bunch of blood in the streets from slaughtering animals. It's a safety issue. It's a environmental hazard, all that stuff. You can have neutral reasons for it, but when the timing lines up, when the people that are what's called disproportionately impacted by it line up, in this case the Santeria religion, they're being disproportionately targeted, and they're using that whole idea of safety and health of the community as a pretext to violate the rights of those Santeria religion in their sacrifice of animals. So that law was struck down on the Gulf Coast. So that's one of those weird situations where you got to pick it out, and sometimes it comes down to a fact by fact, case by case basis. Are we going to allow this law to be in place that discriminates against this religion, or are we not? And sometimes it comes down to, okay, why was the law really made? Was it made because we want to keep people safe from like dirty slaughterhouses, or are we doing it because we just want to make sure that these people can't practice their religion the way they want to? because we happen to not like it. All right, next thing, freedom of speech. This is the one that people are most closely associate the First Amendment with, is freedom of speech. So we got some marchers back in the 60s and 70s. Oddly enough, they look kind of like CIA agents today, but that's just how people dressed back then. People dressed nicer back in the 70s. They always looked like they were going like somewhere important because they always wore suits. All right, freedom of speech protects face-to-face communication, telephone, conversation, lectures, and radio and TV broadcasts. And nowadays, it also includes things like internet access, whether you're going to communicate on social media, on Twitter, Kik, other various areas where you can communicate. Freedom of speech also protects non-spoken speech, art, music, painting, anything that has some kind of artistic value to it. Political commentary. Think about somebody who gets up and makes a political satire, or think like Saturday Night Live. That's art, but it's also talking about politics. Think The Daily Show. With Trevor Noah, used to be Jon Stewart. That is technically a form of art. It's comedy. It's satire related to current events. So that's also political. And this is really true of every First Amendment right as well as every subsequent right that's in the Bill of Rights. It's one of those things that you got to use it or you might lose it, because the idea being that it's just like a muscle. If you don't use your muscles, they get smaller. If you don't exercise your rights, they get smaller. They get weakened over time. Now, freedom of speech does not include the right to endanger our government or other citizens. And here's how that can play out. Oh, let's not go to libel yet. Who's that? If you may have heard this phrase, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, that actually relates to a real case that happened a long, long time ago. It doesn't matter where it happened, but understand that somebody basically yelled the phrase fire in a crowded theater. And this is back during a time where the fire departments were basically horse and buggies with like water tanks and unpressurized hoses. So if there was a fire in a building, people were going to die. That's just what was going to happen. So when someone yells fire in that crowded theater, people panicked. And what do people do when they panic? They stampede. And when people stampede, people fall down, and people got hurt and killed when someone yelled fire in a crowded theater. That's where that whole phrase comes from. You can't take an action that will willfully endanger others unnecessarily. So now, if there were an actual fire in that theater, you're good to go. Yell fire. Please, yell fire. They want to get out. But if you're just doing it as a joke, guess what? Even though that's speech, even though it's poor comedy, it's still comedy. It's just bad comedy, bad sense of humor. Even though all that stuff happened, if you yell fire in a crowded theater and people are getting hurt, that's not protected, because it's reasonable under the circumstance to believe that people will get hurt in that situation. You are not allowed to endanger the lives or the safety of others for the sake of your own right. It's that community interest of safety of the community being put over the individual interest of freedom of speech or the right to make a bad joke. All right, freedom of speech does not include the right to slander or libel someone. Slander is basically speaking an untruth about somebody that damages their reputation and also could theoretically financially damage them. Libel is the same exact thing, but in printed form. So that's the only real difference. So slander is lying about somebody to hurt them, and libel is lying about somebody to hurt them in print. Now, in North Carolina, for the most part, there are a few exceptions to this. In order to have a case of real slander that you can sue on, you have to actually be damaged by it. So if I were to insult a student and say this student is clearly a Martian, or something else equally dumb, that's obviously not true and does no fiscal harm to them, you can't sue for slander. You have to have damages. There are certain exceptions, like in North Carolina, if you saying that somebody has a certain loathsome disease, which really means an STD, if you were to just say that about somebody, you can sue without even proving damages. They're so terrible they assume that the damage happens. If you say someone has committed a felony or a crime, you don't have to prove that you were financially damaged by that statement. It's assumed that when someone accuses you of committing a crime, or that or saying like Mr. Helms is obviously a murderer, he's just hiding out here. Well, that would obviously be untrue. But because you're accusing me of a high crime with no basis and it's untrue, and you're doing it to harm my reputation, I don't have to prove that you hurt me financially. Even if nobody believed it, I could still sue you and possibly force you to pay damages, because it's assumed that when you accuse somebody of that publicly with no basis and you know it's untrue, that you were just doing it to harm them and that they have been harmed by that statement. It becomes a pretty big issue with the news, and there are special exceptions for slander in the news. So let's say a news company starts doing things like just accusing Trump of various items and saying, okay, Trump is this, Trump is that, Trump is working for the Russians, and they have no real proof of it. Well, here's the problem. The news, their job is to inform people, and there's a special exception to that whole slander issue in the First Amendment, That is, anything that is newsworthy can technically get you around. That's how you get around like the National Enquirer saying, I had Bigfoot's baby. Things that are obviously like, okay, that's insane and that can't possibly be true. But the Enquirer still gets things right, like the John Edwards case from a few years ago. That was originally a National Enquirer story. Because they are a news agency, they kind of decide what's newsworthy. So it's very, very, very hard to actually sue and win against a newspaper or a news company or a media outlet for what becomes a damaging statement against your reputation or slander or libel. But it can be done. It's just very, very difficult. And like I said before, printed lies are basically, that's libel. So libel is in print, slander is just over the airwaves or in person or communication over like a telephone kind of game where you just say it back and forth over to people and the message gets spread around. All right, so on to freedom of the press. Freedom of the press. Oh, let's go back one thing. One thing that's not mentioned in this PowerPoint, you probably want to write it down, is there's a special exception to that freedom of speech. Fighting words. If you ever have an issue where, let's say, yes, you obviously have freedom of speech, but you can't threaten somebody. That's the other weird one. So it's not the same as yelling fire in a crowded theater, but you can't say, I'm going to shoot you in the face. Well, no, you can't. You can't. Never mind. It's freedom of speech. You can't prosecute me. No, you've committed a crime, communicating threats. There are verbal crimes. There are crimes that are just you saying something and it's illegal, like threatening someone's life, threatening someone with physical harm. Those are considered exceptions to that freedom of speech requirement as well, because that is also breaking the law. All right, on to freedom of press. All right, freedom of press allows Americans to express themselves in print. Now, this entire concept they came up with it back in the 1700s, when they did not have the internet. So understand this idea of freedom of speech, freedom of the press. What does that mean? It's slowly changing over time, and now with the advent of social media, it's rapidly changing. We're trying to figure out, well, what's a blogger? Is that a member of the press? What if he's just sitting like in his underwear in his basement? Does that make him a journalist? It's that kind of situation. What is going on with the press? Are we going to make the guy who's on CNN in a suit and tie the same as the blogger who's wearing pajamas in his room, just typing up stuff he thinks online? It becomes a very gray area where no one really wants to touch it too much because there's too many implications. Because if you go too hard and say, okay, those people aren't journalists, they don't have that freedom of press, then you run into this issue of, oh, well, do they have the freedom of speech to do it? Is it libel? Is it slander? Is it considered newsworthy? Is this person being an amateur journalist? Is that okay? Does that count? And no one really wants to get into that in too much detail because it kind of defines what is and is not journalism. All right, so this is the New York Weekly Journal. This is an old copy of it from the 1730s, and the author is a guy named Zenger. And there it is, John Peter Zenger. He owned the New York Weekly Journal, and this is during a time period, guys, in history where journalists are not neutral. There would be a Federalist journal. There would be an Anti-Federalist journal. There would be a Democratic-Republican journal when Thomas Jefferson's party came into power. There were pro-Andrew Jackson newspapers. There were pro-John Quincy Adams newspapers. There were bias. Now, this is the 1730s. So this is 30, 40 years before our country's been founded. We're talking about a guy named John Peter Zenger. He's the owner of the New York Weekly Journal, and he printed another man's document that criticized a guy named William Cosby, not Bill Cosby like the pudding pop guy. This is Governor Cosby in New York during the 1730s. Now, keep in mind, this is John Peter Zenger, the owner of the New York Weekly Journal, printing somebody else's thing. So this is not what John Peter Zenger wrote down. This is just what he reprinted. So somebody wrote something bad about the governor, and Zenger decided he was going to reprint it. As a result, he was arrested in 1735, but then he was acquitted, and the acquittal was based on this idea of the press is free to criticize government. That's part of what we want them to do. From John Peter Zenger's trial, there just started this whole tradition of freedom of press. It became like an American ideal. We were like, okay, even though this guy said something bad about the governor, we're going to acquit him because we want the press there to say bad things. We want the press to be critical because the idea is that we want to be informed as citizens, and sometimes we need to be informed about the bad stuff the government's doing. And certainly that nowadays that's just so second nature. We watch the news to know what's going on bad. If it bleeds, it leads. As people, we want to know, okay, what bad stuff is happening right now so I know it's happening, whether it's national or local. One of the most popular items in any given newspaper, and newspapers aren't as popular as they used to be, are the police section where you get to see who got arrested. the tax section, so you get to see which of your neighbors didn't pay their taxes when they get released, and then you got the obituaries. Those three. None of them are terribly positive, but those are the ones that the ad space is the most expensive, that and sports. So on top of all those things, we as a society tend to want to see, or at least know about, the bad stuff that's happening around the world, and certainly the bad stuff happening nearby. So even though it's bad, even though it might be something bad about our government, Zenger started this whole tradition, and his acquittal started this whole precedent that we want our press to be free to criticize or praise depending on what the situation warrants. All right, so major examples of print: books, newspapers, magazines. Where's the internet fall on this? Is it the Wall Street Journal online edition, or is it just some guy with a blog? Where do they fall? Is it up to us as society to decide which one has more value, or is it the government decide which one has more value? And I think so far, as time goes on, government does not interfere with the press, even when it is just that blogger who might be just kind of making something up. So they kind of keep their hands off of it, and they leave people to decide what has more value than something else. So they hope that people would choose, okay, I trust the New York Times over this random blogger that posted something. So we don't make a habit in this country of arresting journalists, even if they're just amateur journalists. All right, freedom of press also includes forms of media such as radio, television, and computer networks. But they are controlled differently. So if we're talking about a newspaper, most newspapers are written at 6th grade level. There's no cursing in them. But that is in part because we have an issue with sales. You don't want to have a newspaper that's just ridden with expletives and everything else, because you want a broad appeal. So you make it kind of humdrum, not a whole lot of you get the news out, but you don't make it very provocative through use of curse words or any kind of gore, that kind of stuff. But on the airwaves, we have the FCC that controls that kind of stuff. So there's gore that's censored out. There is violence that's censored out. Any racial slurs are censored out. You have things censored out like just cursing. So there is a conflict there. But again, you're putting that community interest on one side against the individual interest on the other side. So you want to always understand, as we're going through this lecture, any given right that we have as Americans, it's always balancing the community interest versus the interest of the individual. So the community interest is, well, we don't want our kids hearing about gore, blood and guts and stuff in the middle of the afternoon when they get home from school, and we don't want them hearing cussing at 3 in the afternoon on the television. At the same time, the individual is, I should be able to consume and watch whatever I want to because I'm an American, dang it, that's how this works. Well, when you balance those two things out, we tend to favor the rearing of our children and what they're exposed to at a higher level than that individual guy who wants to hear cuss words on TV. That's just how it's been working out lately. All right, so media. Understand, I put these three up there, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, because media is not perfect. Media is biased. During the night, I'm going to say from the 1930s all the way until probably the early mid-90s, the news kind of had this aura about it, that the news was neutral, that's how we do it. Like Walter Cronkite, those kind of people, now people say Walter Cronkite was kind of biased. But we're thinking like, the World War II reporters, those kind of guys, the people that like broke the Watergate scandal against Nixon. This is neutral investigative reporting. Nowadays, news, I'm going to go out and say it, is biased. CNN, MSNBC have a very liberal tone to their news. Fox News obviously has a very, very conservative tone to it. You also have things like talk radio. But as a student, I want everyone in here to understand that there's a difference between a journalist, somebody who goes out there, reports news, and what we call a talking head or a pundit, somebody who is just there, who is there to basically be part of a debate. If you listen to Rachel Maddow, she is a pundit. She's a host. She is liberal. She believes what she believes in, and she kind of like calls her guests on things that she doesn't like, and that is not necessarily journalism. That is being biased, and it's entertaining, and it's useful to a degree. Same thing with like Sean Hannity or anybody or some other people on Fox News when they go out and they're very conservative. Unabashedly so. They'll come out and say, I'm conservative, and I want to know why you think this way. I'm going to tell you why I think it's wrong. That's not typically, or at least traditionally, what a journalist does. A journalist goes in, asks questions, then reports what was answered, or reports what they found. So it can be somebody looking into corruption in the government. It can be somebody interviewing about a dog show that happened in Nash County to show off all the shelter animals. They're both news. They're both there, and sometimes we get confused. We kind of cross the streams. Is this news, or is this opinion, what amounts to op-eds, opinions, but on the television? If you've ever heard of an op-ed, it's the section of a newspaper where basically You have the opinions of the populace. They write in letters to the editor, that kind of stuff, where they put their opinion in, and it's biased. It's supposed to be biased. It's the opinion of people listening in the area. Fox News has pundits like Sean Hannity that come out, and they're op-ed. They're opinion-based. They put stuff out there that supports their opinion, and they say, this is why my opinion is the best, and that's what they do. They'll also investigate to a certain extent, but we're not talking about pure journalism here. We're talking about biased, opinionated journalism meant to come to a certain conclusion, which is fine because it does serve a purpose. It kind of lets people on one side of things say, okay, this is what I believe in, and these things kind of coincide with it, and I have ways to back up my opinion now. Whereas just neutral news is, okay, what does this mean? They have to self-interpret. It's almost like taking as sad as it sounds, it takes the brain work out of getting the news and forming an opinion with it. You basically find your guy that thinks like you do, and he's already done something with it, and it almost makes the reader or listener a little lazier because they don't have to sit there and filter through all this stuff. Now, that sounds very negative, but think about it, guys. We're not journalists. I'm a teacher. My job is to teach. Some of you are going to grow up and be mechanics or doctors or lawyers. Your job will be something separate. You're going to spend 8 hours a day doing something else. But during that 8 hours, news happens. You want somebody at the end of your day to kind of condense that news down. And this just takes it one step further. They're condensing the news down, and they're also kind of putting their lean on it. So if you're a liberal thinker, you're probably going to watch MSNBC for your news and your interpretation of the news. If you're conservative, you're going to watch the news on Fox News because they're going to give you the news, plus the pundits are then going to give kind of a more conservative interpretation of that news that you're then going to walk away with. Now, that's not necessarily the healthiest thing. I think everybody should watch every network at least once a week to get exposed to alternative viewpoints. But that kind of is the function that news is starting to happen. It's starting to have. It's less about getting neutral news and putting it in your head, and more about getting the news and then kind of getting it filtered to you in a way that you accept it and that you believe it. For better or for worse. At least that's my observation on things. Now, freedom of the press ensures that the American people are exposed to a wide variety of viewpoints and prevents the government from practicing censorship. So that's basically what I just spent about 10 minutes explaining. It's nothing more than the press coming together and saying, we want exposure, whether it's for that blogger who thinks he's got the scoop or that 30-year veteran journalist at the New York Times who knows he has the scoop. We want both of those viewpoints out there and then let the people decide on it. That's the idea of our entire republic, is based on an informed citizenry, that you guys can get home from work, get home from school, and within an hour have a basic understanding of what's been going on in the last 24 hours in the news. You don't want people having to be stuck doing their own research all the time because they wouldn't do it. They don't have time, and then they wouldn't be informed. The news informs people, for better or for worse, and that's the idea behind why I always tell my kids, go watch multiple outlets. Get a wide viewpoint on everything. All right, now censorship is the suppression of an idea or the deletion of material that may be considered objectionable, harmful, or sensitive as determined by a censor. In our case, we're talking about the government as a censor. So, for the most part, the government cannot censor unless there's some regulation, like an FCC regulation against exposing like pictures of decapitated bodies or other horrible, gory things on television during certain times, or cursing. You can't curse on television unless it's a certain time of night when most of the kids are all asleep. That's the basis for it. And again, you're balancing out that community interest versus that individual interest. All right, on to freedom of assembly. All right. Freedom of assembly protects our right to gather in groups, so long as those assemblies are peaceful. So if you're engaging in a protest and you're breaking down windows and stealing stuff from liquor stores, that is not a peaceable assembly. That is a riot. That's a violent assembly. That is not protected. Again, community rights versus individual rights. If you're keeping up with the news in North Carolina, you're probably hearing about something called Moral Monday. They tend to start up right when the weather gets warm, because when it's warm outside, that's the best time to protest because you don't get cold. Moral Monday is basically I guess you say, anti-conservative movement where like teachers, members of the NAACP, they go to Raleigh and they'll basically occupy a certain area of space past closing time. Now, whenever you see somebody being arrested while they're peacefully protesting. Like, let's say they just sit down and won't move. Call it a sit-in. They just sit down, don't do anything, and they still get arrested. They're not getting arrested for just sitting down. They're not getting arrested for peacefully protesting. At that point, they're getting arrested for trespassing. They got arrested at the Capitol not because they were protesting. They got arrested because it was closing time and they were told to leave and they didn't. That makes it trespassing. So usually you're never going to see a criminal charge that says peaceful protesting on the Capitol. That's not a charge. The charge is trespassing after hours at the Capitol building. All right, so there's some pictures of some this is anti-immigration enforcement protests. So this is like pro undocumented immigrant protests in New York. Some more examples: meetings, parades, political rallies, and public celebrations. Now, note, here's the issue here. I can't just grab all of my entire class and have us just get in cars and then go down to the Nash County Courthouse and start protesting. Protesting, even when it's peaceful, has to be permitted. Now, the permitting process is what has to be fair. So they can't charge $10,000 for a protest because that would be a barrier to the protest. But they can charge $20 to like get a parade license or to get a protest license. That is perfectly legal. The idea being that you want something neutral to basically organize things, because you wouldn't want a protest happening every day. It would gum up traffic, and that community interest of having a functional society in the middle of a busy area of town would outweigh the rights of individuals to protest every single day. So you do have issues there. There are times when you're not allowed to protest. They don't want you setting up your protest, or like let's say you want to protest America's immigration policy. Well, they're not going to let you do it in the middle of Nashville on the 4th of July because there's other stuff going on during that time that conflicts with that. You don't want to have a protest going on at the same time as a fireworks display because, people are flammable. You also don't want people protesting, like let's say in front of your house. There are certain restrictions on where you can protest in relation to a private business. Big issue with abortion clinics is how close they can be. And I want to say it's like 200 yards. You can't be out by their door, and that changed around a whole lot with the advent of Roe v. Wade and the abortion cases, because people would literally just start going in like right up to the door of that doctor's office or the abortion clinic office. They'd have protest signs out, and they're like, "No, you can't do this. This is infringing on the community's rights to access of health care." And they basically made them push back to where they couldn't protest right in front of the building. All right, freedom of assembly also implies, and note that word implies because the term freedom of association is nowhere in the Constitution, but it's implied by our ability to assemble. The best example I can give you is the right to join social clubs. That doesn't just mean like the Optimist Club or the Freemasons or Knights of Columbus or the Rotary Club. That can mean gangs. There is no law against being a member of the Blood of the Crips. It doesn't exist. It's perfectly legal. If you want to be an MS-13, the Latin gang, there's no law against it. Now, there are laws against engaging in crime. There are laws against engaging in criminal enterprise, organized crime laws, RICO statutes for racketeering and organized crime. That exists. But there is no law, and it'd be unconstitutional if there was such a law that says you cannot be a member of MS-13. You cannot be a member of the Bloods. You can't start a chapter. Technically, that is not illegal. There is no way a police officer can walk up to somebody who's wearing a red bandana and say, "Hey, you're under arrest." Why, sir? Because that red bandana. That will not be allowed. All right. Freedom of assembly does not give you the right to disrupt the activities of the daily citizens. The daily activities of citizens. You cannot put up a gigantic parade float that blocks access to the local courthouse. That would interrupt the daily activity of citizens. That's why there are certain areas that you're allowed to protest. So when George Bush was president, it came out, there was a lot of controversy over designated protest zones. Well, due to the president's safety, Secret Service concerns, everything else, they basically said you can't protest here, here, or here, but you can protest over here. The issue became that protest they were allowed to have was nowhere near like the motorcade route. So the president would never actually see the person protesting. The people protesting wouldn't get any camera time. That's what they didn't like. So there is a balance. There's still a balance there, and the community's right to having a safe chief executive, so having their president be safe, outweigh the rights of those individual protesters to protest. And again, always understand every one of these rights, especially within the First Amendment context, it's community rights versus the rights of the individual. All right, on to freedom of petition. The First Amendment says that people have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that's basically we can write to the government and demand that they fix things we don't like. So a grievance is just a complaint. A redress is just a way to fix it. And a petition is nothing more than a written document, or sometimes not even a written document. It can be a phone call basically saying, I have this problem, you need to fix it. That's it. Now, that doesn't mean the problem is going to get fixed. We do have the right to petition or ask the government to try to fix it. In other words, we have the right to access our government officials and complain. Coughing. I'm thinking I'm going to randomly scream into this microphone in case somebody's falling asleep. All right, so freedom petition protects the citizens' right to express their ideas to the government. So we have it's almost like a whole separate freedom of speech area. So the freedom of speech is a general ability to say what you want within reason as long as you're not violating the rights of others. The freedom of petition is the ability to say what you want to your government directly. So if Mr. Helms, if you see him out in the public and he wants to talk to you, you can turn around, stick your hand up and go, nope, and just walk away. It'd be rude, but you're allowed to do it. The members of government can't really do that. If I wanted to go down to the judge's office, who's an elected official, and say, "Hey, I'd like to set up a meeting, or I'd like to be able to stay here until I can talk to the judge," I might be waiting for a while, and I might not get to see him that day. But what they can't do is say, "No, sir, get out of here. You're not allowed to be in this building." I have the right to access my government officials because I'm a member of the public, and they are government employees, and they're elected officials. I can't be thrown out of the mayor's office for just asking to see him. I can't be thrown out of a county commissioner's office just for asking to see them because I am a member of the county. I'm a citizen. I'm allowed to talk to my government officials. I can write them in a form of a letter, all those things. There can be no law that says you are not allowed to write to the mayor. That's illegal. It's a misdemeanor. That would be unconstitutional because we have a protected First Amendment right to petition our government and government officials. All right. Remember way back when we talked about the foundation of our government, that the first thing that the First Continental Congress did, not the second one, the Second Continental Congress wrote the Declaration of Independence. The First Continental Congress was trying to fix our issues with Great Britain, so we actually petitioned King George with a set of grievances that we want to redress. Now, King George said no. Well, guess what? Our government can say no, too. I think the most famous one that came out recently, there is a website where we actually, it's like change.org, there's a few others, where they actually create online petitions. And if they reach a certain number, the government has to give a statement on them. It can be very short, it can be very legalese and well thought out, but the petitions can sometimes be silly because the way the online world works, things go viral and get crazy. The most famous one in recent memory that I can think of is the movement to have Justin Bieber exiled from the country, like basically have him, I'm losing the word in my head now. Oh gosh, I'm not going to remember it. Oh, that's so terrible. I can't remember a vocab word. I'm a terrible teacher. Not export, that's with goods. What am I thinking of? Deported. God almighty, that was going to kill me all day. There was a movement to actually have Justin Bieber, through petition to the government, as in there was an actual petition that I think reached 100,000 signatures pretty daggone fast, to deport Justin Bieber back to Canada. Now, the government obviously had to then come out and say, we're not going to do it because there's no legal They actually had to release a statement on why they could not deport Justin Bieber. And I'll try to find that actual statement later on, and I'll show it to you because it's pretty funny. But it's just an example of our ability to petition our government for redress of grievances, Justin Bieber, and then have them throw it back in our face and say, sorry, we can't do that. All right, nowadays, a petition, they're online usually, but there's also other petitions, like there's signature petitions. You'll see every now and then you'll see somebody, especially in like larger cities, you'll have people waiting outside of restaurants with clipboards and say, well, you'd like to sign this and help us protect the environment. And it'll be like a pollution ordinance that they're trying to get passed at the local level. That's a petition. There can also be a letter to your congressman or an email nowadays or phone calls. All those are forms of petition. Now, a public protest and demonstration is also protected as a peaceful assembly. It's also technically a form of petition because a lot of these protests, they'll happen in places that are government-oriented. Now, there's other kinds of protests, like you had the March on Wall Street and the Occupy Wall Street movements. Those were protests against Wall Street bankers and really kind of capitalism. not against the government per se. There are other protests where they just go right to the Capitol building. They just sit there and they protest and yell at the White House, or they yell at the rotunda at the Capitol, or they yell at the Washington Monument, whatever. Just basically protest what government is doing. But again, for large protests and even sometimes small protests, like one person, they have to get a permit to be there from their local government. So if you want to protest in Nash County, you're going to probably need to go to the permitting office and say, hey, I want to have a protest here. I want to mark off this area for this date between these times, and I won't go outside those times. And the moment you do go outside those times, you are engaging in protest without a permit, which is technically a violation of law, and you can be arrested or fined for it. So there is still, even with freedom to protest, freedom of petition, freedom of peaceable assembly, there are constraints. And those constraints are, we want an orderly society, especially in those downtown areas where business is conducted, and that community interest of having the economy going, having daily activities of that town not being interrupted, that community interest outweighs the interest of the individual. And remember, this is all conditioned on those protests being peaceful. The moment a brick goes through a shop window, the moment somebody gets hit over the head or yanks off somebody's Trump hat, it's no longer peaceful anymore, and it's basically lost its constitutional protection. All right, on to limits to First Amendment freedoms. In general, and actually in complete, honestly, so not even saying in general, there's no real exception to this. Every single right that we have is limited to some degree. It just depends on what's going on. No right is absolute. No right's unlimited. The rights of individuals, and I've said this throughout the entire PowerPoint and this entire lecture, is that the community interest has to be balanced against the individual interest. That's how this whole idea works. And it can be a fact-by-fact, case-by-case issue. The general rule of thumb, if there is a conflict where the rights of the community come first. If you ever want to watch a really great movie, watch Star Wars Wrath of Khan. And one of the most famous lines from it is, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And that was me nerding and geeking out, so I'm going to hear some laughter randomly in my classroom when you're all listening to this. But yes, that's exactly what's going on here. It's the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few, Wrath of Khan, all that fun stuff. Now, take a look at this cartoon. It's from 2007. Imagine what the framers were thinking. The framers, even back then, because remember, 1787 is when our Constitution was written. The Bill of Rights were put in by 1791. John Peter Zenger, the most famous case of freedom of the press, that was 1735. So these folks were all, for the most part, were lawyers, and they were keenly aware of everything that was going on as far as the right to petition, the right to press. They'd also been recently oppressed by the British government, all that stuff. They were very aware of it. So they even wanted people to be free to be a pain in the neck. A good example being Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a very, very famous guy, but you know what? He ticked off a lot of people. He was right about a lot of things with Great Britain and freedoms, but he ticked off people. And this guy on the far right saying freedom to be a complete pain in the neck. Well, that's kind of part of it. You're allowed to be a butt. You're allowed to not be a good person. Remember that whole rights, duties, responsibilities went over? You don't have the right to inflict harm on somebody, but there's nothing requiring you as a U.S. citizen to not be a jerk. You can be a complete pain. You can be the person that somebody sees walk into a restaurant and they're like, oh God, I got to walk out of here because I can't stand being near in the same room as this person. You can be that guy. You're allowed to do it. It's legal. There's nothing we can do to stop you really as a society, because those laws, if they were made, would be technically illegal. So understand that these rights are limited, but overall, you pretty much have the freedom to not be a good person in general. So take that for what it's worth. And that's the whole lecture, guys. It's a longer one, so sorry, but the First Amendment is probably one of the most studied areas of law and of constitutional theory. So it's a pretty big old deal. So make sure you review this lecture. You might want to rewatch it again, listen to it, just to get the idea really cemented in your head, maybe find ideas for current event assignments. And good luck with you. I'll probably assign something related to this to do as homework at some point.